We ended the previous episode with the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in September 1598. One of his last acts before he died was to order his invasion army to withdraw from Korea. But ending a war isn't always so easy. In this concluding episode of our Imjin War series, we're going to see how the final months of the conflict played out. Before we get going, I want to thank all of you who've supported my channel by subscribing and commenting on and liking my videos. It's been great to know that there's an audience out there that enjoys this kind of content. Again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. The Chinese had initially planned to send their army back to southern Korea in April 1598 to dislodge the Japanese. The flare-up of a rebellion in Liaodong province necessitated that this be delayed. It was only after stamping out this trouble that the Ming army was free to return to Korea in June. After congregating in Seoul, it would proceed south in 3 groups: an east route army of 24,000 Ming troops and 5,500 Koreans under General Ma Gui, a central route army of 26,800 Ming troops and 2,300 Koreans under General Dong Yiyuan, and a west route army of 13,600 Ming troops under General Liu Ting, also known as Big Sword Liu, reinforced by 10,000 Koreans under Korean Commander-in-Chief Won Yul. Chinese naval forces were also on the move. The Chinese had held their navy back up to this point in the war to protect their own coastline from possible Japanese invasion. Now, in the summer of 1598, it began to shift some squadrons across the Yellow Sea to the west coast of Korea. Most would remain there. A vanguard force under Admiral Chen Lin would continue on around Korea's southwestern corner to reinforce the Korean Navy under Sun-shin, which had grown considerably since the Battle of Noryang in October of the previous year. Sun-shin, at his base on Kogum Island, now has approximately 100 newly built warships and a total of 16,000 men. Chen Lin, arriving in August 1598, would bring with him an additional 5,000 men, aboard 6 warships, and a number of lighter vessels, mainly transports unsuitable for fighting. In the coming battles, Chen Lin would transfer many of his men to serve aboard the Koreans' more heavily built ships. The Japanese, meanwhile, 64,700 of whom still remain in Korea, they still don't know that Hideyoshi has died, and that his final order was that they were to withdraw from Korea. The 5 regents, the senior daimyo now holding the reins of power, have been keeping this secret to preserve stability in Japan. Rumors have been circulating, but there's still no definite news. So as far as the Japanese are concerned, the war still continues. The East Route Army arrived at Tosan, Kato Kiyomasa's fortress, in late October 1598. Its commander, General Ma Gui, had been here before, back in February, at the horrific Battle of Tosan. From that experience, he has grown cautious. He lays siege to Tosan now, but makes no move to attack. Further west, on the other side of Pusan, the Central Route Army under General Dong Yiyuan arrives at Shimazu Yoshihiro's stronghold at Sacheon. General Dong had not previously fought the Japanese, and so he's brimming with confidence. He orders an attack. Heavy casualties are suffered, a mass of Chinese and Korean bodies piling up at the base of the walls. The Japanese then launched a surprise attack, charging out of the gates and surprising the Allied army and throwing it into retreat all the way back to Chinju. When the fighting is over, between 7,000 and 8,000 Chinese and Koreans are dead, and General Dong is no longer quite so confident. Finally, at the west end of the Japanese fortress chain, the West Route Army under Big Sword Liu has reached Konishi Yukinaga's stronghold just outside Sun-shin, a fortress perched on Gwangyang Bay, encircled by stone and earth walls and a moat. As the Allied army arrives and sets up camp, Konishi sends out a message asking for a meeting to negotiate peace. Big Sword Liu agrees, but it's a trick. He organizes with Yi Sun-shin and Chen Lin a combined land and sea assault on the fort to begin when Konishi opens the gate and steps out. The plan fails. Cannons begin firing too soon, alerting Konishi before he's out in the open. The Chinese and Korean Army and Navy would go on to make repeated attacks on the fort over the next 2 weeks, but it was impregnable. They would be unable to dislodge Konishi. It was only now, in early November 1598, that the Japanese in Korea received official word that Hideyoshi had indeed died in September, and that his dying order had been that they leave Korea and return home. This would be relatively easy to do for Shimazu Yoshihiro's force at Sacheon. They had driven General Dong Yiyuan's army all the way back to Chinju, and the Korean and Chinese navy were tied up with the blockade of Sun-shin. Kato Kiyomasa at Tosan was in even a better position, for there were no enemy naval forces or ground forces at all in the area. General Ma Gui, after hearing of the heavy losses suffered at Sacheon, had lifted his siege and withdrawn his forces to Gyeongju. Throughout the rest of the month and into December, Kato ships horses and excess supplies and some of his men back to Japan, but remains at Tosan himself, reluctant to leave and give up the Korea campaign. At the western end of the fortress chain, meanwhile, Konishi Yukinaga's situation isn't good. He's trapped, hemmed in on land by Big Sword Liu's army, and by sea by the Korean and Chinese navy under Yi Sun-shin and Chen Lin. In a bid to extricate himself, Konishi makes peace overtures to Big Sword Liu, sending him a stream of messages and presents. These eventually have the intended effect. Big Sword Liu agrees to back off with his army. Konishi then goes to work on the navy, plying Chen Lin and Yi Sun-shin with gifts. Chen Lin is receptive and tries to talk Yi Sun-shin into backing off and letting the Japanese leave. Yi Sun-shin angrily refuses, so angrily that the two commanders almost get into a fight. In a desperate bid to get out of the trap, Konishi asks Chen Lin to allow a single boat to pass through the blockade, to inform the Japanese garrisons further east to go ahead with their evacuations. Chen agrees. This boat then heads east to summon help. Yi Sun-shin is livid when he learns what Chen has done. He suspects that the Chinese admiral was trying to pressure him into lifting the blockade. On the evening of December 15, as Yi Sun-shin expected, 300 Japanese ships appear at the end of Noryang Strait. The Allied navy advances toward the west end of the strait to meet them, blocking the entrance to Gwangyang Bay. The Koreans have 85 heavy warships. The Chinese, 6 large war junks and 57 smaller galleys. The Japanese navy is numerically larger, but many of Shimazu Yoshihiro's ships are lightly built transports, no match for the cannons the Koreans and Chinese possess. The Battle of Noryang was fought the next day, December 16th, 1598. The Allied Korean and Chinese Navy was divided into 3 squadrons as it went into the attack. Sun-shin in command on the right, Chen Lin at the center, and Ming commander Deng Yiyuan on the left. Chen Lin's flagship was soon surrounded, and he was forced to fight for his life, Japanese warriors fighting their way on board and wounding Chen's son, who was fighting at his side. Deng Yiyuan, attempting to come to his aid, was accidentally killed by friendly fire. Sun-shin, meanwhile, was rampaging through the Japanese fleet, destroying 10 enemy ships with his own flagship alone. The Japanese, suffering heavy losses, began to fall back down the strait, Sun-shin in pursuit, determined not to let even one of their vessels escape. Suddenly, he slumped to the deck. A musket ball had struck him in the chest, a mortal wound. He gasped out, "Don't let the men know." Then he died. His son and nephew, who had been at his side, carried Yi into his cabin before anyone noticed and kept his death a secret for the rest of the battle. When it was all over, the Japanese had lost 200 of their 300 ships. But Shimazu Yoshihiro had achieved his purpose. He had diverted the Korean and Chinese Navy long enough for Konishi Yukinaga and his contingent to evacuate their fortress and depart in their ships. Shimazu's surviving 100 ships fell back to Busan after that to complete the evacuation. The last Japanese ship would leave Korea on December 24th, 1598, bringing to a close nearly 7 years of conflict. The Imjin War was finally over. Back at Noryang, the Koreans were mourning the loss of Sun-shin. His body would be carried north to Ulsan in Chungcheong province to be buried on a hillside overlooking Yi's family home. The Korean government, which had treated Yi so badly, now became generous with its recognition and rewards, promoting him to posthumous high government rank and ordering a shrine built at Yi's former base at Yosu. Additional honors would follow in the decades that passed, most notably the bestowal of the title Chungmugong, Minister of Loyal Valor, in 1643. It is this honorific that Koreans typically use today when speaking of their greatest hero. He is Chungmugong Sun-shin.
서쪽 상동 사거리 방향 횡단보도에 녹색불이 켜졌습니다. 건너가도 좋습니다. 정렬 신호로 바뀌었습니다.